very much, Simone, for putting all this together at a very busy time in this semester. And Simone's title is Generalissimo Francisco Franco is Still Dead, or Is He? Lessons in the Power of Visual Rhetoric.
Okay, so a little bit of background. I've been all but dissertation for several years, and I'm winding it up. We're trying to wrap it all up and graduate here. A few of my friends put together a motivational gift at the beginning of the fall semester, and Ron was one of the contributors. So this was my final push of motivation to get me to finish my dissertation. And Ron and I were just talking that it was pretty successful. As I was putting together my PowerPoint, I was like, oh, well, I could have done this years ago. So I did want to thank my friends that contributed to my motivational gift for that. Okay, so I'm going to start with a short video, and it is from a 1975 episode of SNL, and then we'll go from there. And Hulu has ads, so.
100 million pounds.
Sorry, I can't read it.
That's how much garbage visitors to our national parks add to the country's landfills each year. This year, Subaru is sharing
I did
their
this for
zero
you, Mike.
landfill expertise.
Thank you very
with
much.
national parks.
Visual rhetoric.
To work
I think,
towards
does it say skip ad at the top?
garbage there.
No, it's a swap.
It says swap ad, you get a different one if you don't like it.
I can tweet
It's
it.
wonderful.
Pick your poison.
Yeah, exactly. Don't like this environmental one?
Well, after a long illness, Generalissimo Francisco Franco died Wednesday. Reactions from world leaders were varied. Held in contempt as the last of the fascist dictators in the West by some, he was also eulogized by others, among them Richard Nixon, who said, quote, General Franco was a loyal friend and ally of the United States. He earned worldwide respect for Spain through firmness and fairness. Despite Franco's death and an expected burial tomorrow, doctors say the dictator's health has taken a turn for the worse.
Okay, so I use that intentionally. Obviously, with visual rhetoric, and as far as its relevance to academia, it often overlaps with pop culture. And so in 1975, bringing Generalissimo Francisco Franco's death into pop culture with Saturday Night Live, I mean, it just opened up a whole lot of doors for parody, for satire, all of those things. Now, obviously, I don't know if you guys are aware of the cultural reference here, but in the media leading up to Franco's final death, the American media had covered his health, his failing health, for weeks. Much like the media does nowadays with just about anything, they just agonized over it. It was over and over and over again. Francisco Franco's still sick. Francisco Franco's still sick. He's going to die soon. He's going to die soon. And so Chevy Chase took that and said, okay, he's dead, right? And so he announced that on SNL, and then it became a recurring skit. So this is a shorter.
And now, as a public service to those of our viewers who have difficulty with their hearing, I will repeat the top story of the day, aided by the headmaster of the New York School for the Hard of Hearing, Garrett Morris. Our top story tonight.
Our top story tonight.
Francisco Franco is still dead.
Is still dead.
Good night and have a pleasant.
Good night and have a pleasant tomorrow.
Okay. So, Generalissimo Francisco Franco is still dead. This tagline from the first season of Saturday Night Live was made famous during Chevy Chase's Weekend Update segment as a mockery of the weeks-long media coverage of Franco's failing health. In response to President Nixon's statement, General Franco was a loyal friend and ally of the United States. He earned worldwide respect for Spain through firmness and fairness. Chase revealed a photograph of Franco giving the Nazi salute along Adolf Hitler, which you heard the applause and the laughter in the background. While repeated references during Saturday Night Live may have made Franco relevant in the 1970s popular culture, their choice of images also, perhaps accidentally, reveals much about the way scholars and most historians study the long-dead Spanish dictator. Despite his 40-year reign as the leader of Spain, as compared to Hitler's approximately 10-year reign as the Führer of Germany, Franco is seen in many ways as parallel to, yet less historically significant as, Hitler. While their political affiliations, military experience, and ascension to power actually reveal incredible differences, Franco's and Hitler's overall images, such as physical appearance, style of communication, and media presence, prove remarkably similar. And all of these things proved both Hitler and Franco to be skilled users of visual rhetoric. However different the outcomes of their rises to and demonstrations of power, both leaders were able to convey images of strength and ability during times of international pain and struggle. Of course, Hitler after World War I, and then Franco again after World War I. It is ironic that Franco is arguably less historically significant as Hitler, despite seemingly adopting many of his mannerisms and political approaches, but his ability to maintain his position of authority for nearly 4 times as long as Hitler may also prove him to be a more effective rhetorician. Most scholarship about Generalissimo Francisco Franco focuses on his military prowess, his rise to power, and his legacy as the 40-year dictator of Spain. He's rarely spoken of with any real admiration by those who have any notable awareness of him. And more often than not, knowledge of Franco is limited among average Americans. Much of the lack of awareness of Franco's rise to power and leadership style once he was in his position as leader of Spain is actually an effect of the very intentional visual campaign produced by Franco and his supporters. All right. Okay. So a little bit of background about Franco, and here's just kind of a timeline visually of what Franco looked like. He enjoyed a long life, despite being a fascist dictator. So he was part of a military legacy. The Franco family, his father was very high up in the ranks of the Spanish Navy, and Franco had every intention of joining the Navy in his father's footsteps, but they weren't accepting new naval cadets at the time that Franco was eligible. So he kind of begrudgingly joined the Spanish Army. It ended up being quite opportune for him because as Spain was acquiring Morocco or Moroccan territory, Franco was climbing in the ranks, and he ended up being an integral part of their dominance of the Rif War. So he developed quite a name for himself as a military leader during that time. And right around the time of the Second Spanish Republic in the 1930s, he was kind of at his peak of military successes. He was in opposition to Manuel Azaña, who was elected into leadership of the Second Spanish Republic in 1936, and that's kind of what prompted this kind of, I just lost the word, revolt against them. So in April 1936, they had a legal election. They elected this Republican government, and then the nationalists, led by Francisco Franco, revolted. Okay. So a little bit of background about the Spanish Civil War, so that we can get into the good stuff, the art. Historically, the Spanish Civil War took place between World War I and World War II, and erupted after many years of countrywide conflict. While the actual war was signaled by the rising of nationalist leaders against the elected Republican government in July of 1936, this clash was merely a culminating event of the underlying conflicts between various Spanish forces that had dominated much of the Spanish history. Some describe the Spanish Civil War as a war of opposites, so religious against atheism, rich against poor, fascism against democracy. Others view it as the result of 3 major fights between the classes, authoritarian rule against libertarian instinct, and central government against regionalist aspirations. Regardless of the accuracy of these perspectives, history shows that political, social, and religious divisions were a driving force behind most of Spain's conflicts, and specific events in Spanish politics and the political climate abroad were instrumental in the outbreak and ultimately the outcome of the war. The global climate in the 1930s was one of fear and recovery. By the end of the First World War, several countries found themselves in conflict, economic ruin, and in fear of what they knew would become another catastrophic international war. In the midst of all this global unrest, Spaniards found themselves at odds and in a battle for control of their divided government. Although the Spanish Civil War continued for a mere 3 years, so it was from July 1936 until March of 1939, the events leading up to it were extensive, and the atrocities that took place during the 3 years were poignant. One side was backed by wealth, political clout, and the Catholic Church, and struggled to keep certain foreign allies at arm's length while dissuading other enemies from interjecting in their fight to take over Spain. The other side was fighting for their land, their rights, and their lives without religion or money, and alienated by politicians who were too afraid to stand up to Franco, including some allies who refused to offer any significant aid. The pleas were decidedly different, as money and faith aided the nationalists in presenting the logical and credible front, and what the Republic lacked in ethos and logos they made up for with inconceivable passion and expressions of despair. The Republic successfully reached the emotions of thousands of fellow Europeans as well as Americans, but their pathos was overruled by Franco's ethos and logos and the other forces that came to his aid as he remained in power for, like we said, almost 40 years. So what I've got here is a chart explaining the divisions of power and support during the Spanish Civil War, just to give you some kind of concepts as we go on. But I put asterisks next to the international interventions because the nearly 24 countries had signed a non-intervention agreement because they were trying to prevent World War II. And among them was the Soviet Union, fascist Italy, and Nazi Germany. So this was all kind of instigated by England. They did not want this. France did not want this. And so for the most part, France and England upheld the non-intervention agreement. But these folks kind of subtly at first and then more blatantly just kept offering aid. Now, the international brigades, that also included the Abraham Lincoln Brigades from America, which was thousands of volunteer soldiers who came just as like a mission of sympathy, really, including Ernest Hemingway and George Orwell. Okay, so a little bit of background about my dissertation, which is what this is from. A study of the significance of the visual rhetoric of the Spanish Civil War will actually reveal much about the way we apply meaning to what we see, how we use and understand visual artifacts, and how major powers around the world are motivated to act or remain inactive. While this significance may be reached through a thorough survey of major rhetorical theories and historical data, simplification of this information is most important if one goal is to raise awareness and another is to provide a model for understanding the power of visual rhetoric. I say simplification because as a scholar of rhetoric, I can tell you there's thousands of years of rhetorical theory. So trying to do a thorough rhetorical analysis is almost impossible. So the theory guiding my dissertation is the following. Using primarily Kenneth Burke's theories from a grammar of motives and a rhetoric of motives as a framework, the immediate and lasting impression of Franco's image in the nationalist visual campaign, and the delayed power of Picasso's Guernica and disappointing failure of the Republican visual campaign will be investigated as an integral component of the outcome of the Spanish Civil War and its lingering effects in Spain and around the world. The Spanish Civil War transcended typical propaganda, and distinct differences in style, memory, and delivery from each side cannot go unnoticed. These differences help to explain the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of each visual campaign. The nationalists succeeded in defeating the Republicans and ruling over Spain for 40 years, yet the Republicans gained the sympathies of foreigners, and the subsequent images will forever remind global powers of their choices to remain uninvolved. One important question remains: how is it possible that Franco was able to succeed when now, even decades later, the enormity of his terrible deeds are so blatantly obvious in the visual remnants of his regime? To at least one rhetorician, the answer lies in the motives of the rhetor and the audience. As Kenneth Burke's theories are rooted in human response to symbol, their application to explain the international power of images proves fruitful. Through a successful application of his dramatistic pentad and his theory of identification, it's quite possible to conclude that Franco and his nationalists achieved such monumental success almost entirely because of their visual campaign. So, what did that mean? The way I designed it or organized it is that their campaign can kind of fall into three categories. The first is the image of Francisco Franco, which I've already kind of established presented strength in the time of fear, so trying to prevent another world war. The other one is their ministry of propaganda. So despite all of this unrest, they had all of the support of the government, the military, and the Catholic Church, and so they were able to create these kind of institutions, and institutions add to credibility. And then the third one is Franco was smart. So when all was said and done, he was able to stay in power because publicly he seemed like a pretty good guy. And one of the things that he did was he created a monument dedicated to the fallen soldiers and kind of kept the other stuff hidden or secret. So overall, unification propaganda incorporated visual traditions and references to fundamental beliefs associated with the factions supporting the rebellion. A new iconography was devised, rewriting history to foster the idea that the rebel factions voluntarily and spontaneously joined together under Franco's providential leadership. So essentially, they created a history, and they said they needed Franco. See, look how much of a hero he was. He unified Spain. Nobody was happy under that leadership. We gave them a great option. The simplest symbols in the nationalist zones were restorative. So reversion to the red and gold Spanish national flag. They changed the flag. They went back to a classical flag, which made it seem like, see, we're unifying Spain. And then they also started kind of reaching out to classical Spanish symbols in an effort to kind of just bring it back old school. Okay. So the first thing, the image of Francisco Franco. And I want to show you, this is kind of how the methodology is going into place. It's very a simplified methodology. I'm taking Kenneth Burke's dramatistic pentat, which are these 5 things. So agent, agency, act, purpose, and scene. And I'm looking at specific images or series of images and showing how this pentat allowed Franco to obtain or maintain power. So the first act was the control of and saturation of Franco's image via art and other media, and the use of religious and military iconography. Basically, the purpose of this was to establish strength and security. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then I'll move on to the next one. In a fashion similar to Hitler, Francisco Franco became the face of nationalist Spain. Not only did he look similar to Hitler, but he delivered speeches as grand productions, maintained a structured and militaristic appearance and entourage, and he maintained a relationship with the church to achieve political ends. His image and conduct were desirable to his audience because he appeared to identify with their struggles, allowing him to advance politically. Burke explains, if, in the opinion of a given audience, a certain kind of conduct is admirable, then a speaker might persuade the audience by using ideas and images that identify his cause with that of conduct, that kind of conduct. That's his basic theory of identification. It's actually called consubstantiality, where I can maintain my own identity, but I can also identify with yours, making us together a new entity. Okay. Franco took every opportunity to deliver the news of Spain to the foreign public as well, with the rise of photojournalism and raised presence of foreign correspondents in Spain during the Civil War. Barry explains, because visual images speak with an experiential, associationistic, and holistic logic, it is important to recognize that they are particularly susceptible to manipulation by political and commercial structures. Franco had both political and economic motivations. What would Spain become under a Republican government? No longer controlled by the Catholic Church or wealthy, but run by men and women who labor day to day. Whereas the impassioned Republicans renounced religion altogether, Franco knew there were plenty of citizens who feared abandoning faith, and he played on that fear with his propaganda. He was often portrayed in paintings or photographs and montages as a literal embodiment of Spain, which you can see in the picture to the left. They also created what scholars call the crusade myth, and it was used to legitimize in the eyes of those with power an effective purge of state institutions, public offices, schools, universities, and the professions, and rigidly control the flow of information in the public sphere. So in most instances where you saw Franco's image, he almost had a glow about him. There were often Catholic symbols around him, lots of traditional Spanish color symbolism used, animals, things like that that kind of showed I embody Spain. And they also introduced this idea of the crusade, because this is one of the historical events that at that time all Spaniards agreed on. We won the Crusades, right? So they tried to play on that. I do want to kind of point out before I move on that Georgette conducted an interview with me, and she used to visit Spain during the 60s when Franco was still in power. So one of the things that I discovered during those interviews is that on top of everything else, with the imagery, naming, changing street names, using different monuments, things like that, he also would interrupt television programming on the regular to just come out on his balcony, wave, and say "Viva la," say it. You're so much better at it. Viva España. You can't do my Spanish very well. And so even after he had gained power, once he was there and established, and there was no real threat to his power, he still kept up with that image to try to constantly unite Spain. So I just thought that was an interesting thing also. And again, you know, we've got the, I liked this picture of the lighter because I kind of feel like that's like modern day propaganda at its best, right? Just give them everyday things where you're reminded of Franco as the savior. All right, the next chapter is about the ministry of propaganda and what I'm calling the creation of truth. The image up here, it's small, but I couldn't fit it on a PowerPoint slide. This is actually a 6-fold brochure promoting battlefield tours during the Spanish Civil War. And there is a permanent exhibit in California, at the University of California in San Diego, where you can see these. And there's a guy with the last name Southworth who did a lot of this research, but I'll talk about it at the end. But this particular brochure is really interesting. I'm going to give you a couple of segments from what's inside of it. It says, National Spain invites you to visit the war route of the North. See history in the making among Spanish scenery of unsurpassed beauty. Another thing that they said was, form your own judgment of the real situation in national Spain today. So the gist of this is that while battlefield tours had been occurring as far back as the Battle of Waterloo, this was the first time that battlefield tours occurred during an active war. So Franco was inviting, and specifically the tourism director, I'm sorry, I just blanked on this. Bolin was in charge of tourism and was very strongly related or active in the Ministry of Propaganda. He would target European journalists and would invite them to come to these. So what they would do is they would go to all of the major places where nationalists had been injured or where they had a lot of deaths. And so they had scripts that all of these tour guides had to read during the tours. And the scripts would focus on their version of the history. So the Republicans staged this attack. This many of our nationalist forces were killed. And so the way they saw it was that this they were able to dedicate this land to their fallen comrades, while also kind of creating a history so that then those journalists could go back to their homes and say, oh my gosh, the Republicans did this to these nationalists, we need to leave them alone, we should support Franco, right? So it's kind of interesting. I don't know if have you guys heard of the painting by Picasso, Guernica? Okay, I'm gonna talk about that later, but one of the tours went to Basque Country, and the script there was talking about how the Republicans staged this attack of Guernica, Spain, and staged it to make it look like the nationalists had done it, but they actually did it themselves. And this is in history books that were published during Franco's reign. So it's to the point where Franco created an alternate history. Now it's obviously not one that's lasted. The history that we know is that the Condor Legion of the Nazi Germany bombed Guernica, Spain. But at that time, people were getting this story. And it was because of these battlefield tours. Now, as far as the pen tag goes, there is the promotion of international tourism, because you can invite tourists to a country only when there's some stability there. And so while there's a war going on and everybody knew about the war, they wanted to invite them and prove that they were stable and it was safe to come. Don't worry about it. So as long as they were getting that tourist money, the nationalists could survive as an entity and it was all good. They were gaining support from these people and they were minimizing intervention from those people. And the scene, of course, is during wartime, which is what makes it so rhetorically significant. And they had the agency of an actual government agency as their support to add to their credibility. Okay, I showed two two pictures here intentionally. Does anybody know this? Has anybody ever been to Spain? I know you have, Georgia. Have you seen this?
No.
So this is significant in many ways, but I showed two images because this is kind of that postcard image where it shows the whole monument and then it has the monumental cross. This is something somebody took from a road driving around. And this is miles from where the monument is. And I feel like that's an important thing to note because miles away from where the monument is in the mountains, that cross still looks really, really big. And that's because it's the largest monumental cross in the world. So as far as architecture goes, it's very significant. Just months after the Spanish Civil War ended, the war was in conflict again with the outbreak of World War II. Franco, now in power as a fascist dictator, conceived the idea for the Valle de los Caídos, or the Valley of the Fallen, as a national act of atonement and reconciliation. That was the official report. In the 1940s, Republican prisoners, several of whom were killed or injured in the process, began building the Valley of the Fallen in Sierra de Guadarrama, 20 miles up in the mountains from Brunet. You usually will fly into Madrid and then take a tour that goes near Madrid to see it. And it's right down the street from El Escorial, which is much more common as a tourist destination. This structure, intended as a monument to the dead soldiers of the Civil War, and especially to the victorious leader Francisco Franco, is topped by the tallest memorial cross in the world. In reality, the memorial services, it serves its purpose for Franco supporters, but it also serves as a painful reminder of the tragedies experienced by Franco's opposition. Over 30 years after Franco's death, Spain finds itself divided still, with a lingering and historically familiar struggle to find balance between a national identity and secularity within its various regions. From November 2009 to June 2012, the monument was closed for renovation. I'm going to do that in air quotes. Although there was much debate about the true reason behind the closing of the monument. Some stories were that it was just renovation, and that part is at least somewhat accurate because I guess somewhere around here there is some damage, and so they wanted to repair that. In the news, when I was there in 2010, there was some debate about how they were going to permanently close the monument, and people were upset about it because they wanted to value it for its architectural feats. There was also some debate or some reports that they were trying to identify mass graves and start actually identifying the bodies because hundreds of Republican soldiers were buried in mass graves at the base of the monument. Now, since 2012, the renovations continue, but they opened the basilica because there's still active services that happen down there, and they've kind of abandoned the mission of identifying the bodies. They said it was just impossible, and so they moved on. So there's still just mass graves at the base of the monument. Regardless of whether the monument is ever open to visitors again, its presence will forever serve as a reminder of the 3 years when Spaniards found themselves at odds, and when thousands of citizens and international volunteers lost their lives in a war of conflicting beliefs, values, lifestyles, and faiths. Okay, I am going to end with this, and I had Molly look at it, she goes, I don't understand this slide. So I'm going to try to explain. I'm only covering half of this study. So my dissertation is basically, here's this side, here's that side, and then my conclusion is my assessment of who won. Okay? So I'm going to try to get this as clear as possible. The Republic relied almost solely on emotional appeals to their various audiences. And based on the legacy with which the various Republican images have left the world, particularly this painting, the emotions did last beyond expectation, but they were not immediately successful. The lack of success for the Republic may be a simple question of audience analysis and poor timing, or a lack of kairos. In Toward a Psychology of Art, Rudolf Arnheim explains that the viewer's response to images are based on the observer's entire life experience and involve his convictions, values, biases, memories, and preferences. These responses are not apart from emotion. In fact, Arnheim states, art requires the judging of meaning, relevance, and truth, and again, the task is accomplished largely by the mysterious capacity of feeling. However successful the Republicans were at appealing to the emotions of a good number of citizens, they did not provide a comfort a world divided by war needed. Still recovering from World War I, the collective public was looking for easy and safe answers. Taking advantage of Kairos, Franco presented the credible front war-torn societies needed to convey the structure and the safety they craved. Still, as a rhetor, Franco's motives may not have been virtuous even in inception. Aristotle acknowledged that an effective rhetor could use rhetoric to meet good or bad ends, although he hoped ethics and good character would pull through in the end. The key in successful rhetoric is to find the correct blend of the three appeals, which we've talked about, ethos, pathos, and logos, and to use a proof-centered approach. First, the practical intelligence, virtuous character, and goodwill of the rhetor must be established, so ethos. Franco and the nationalists had the appeal of offering social and political stability, and they were also supported by the church. Next, the argument must be presented in a logical, factual way. Despite the nationalists overturning a government that was voted into office by a slight majority, they maintained the backing of most of the military and police organizations. Therefore, Republicans, as challengers to the establishment, logically began to look like outlaws. But perhaps the major downfall of the Republic resistance was their failure to respond to the emotional disposition of their audience. Finally, although Aristotle urged rhetorics not to use emotion to detract from the facts of a case, he did contend that they should be aware of the emotional disposition of their audience. And this is the key to the success of the Franco regime. Because nationalists maintained an awareness of the distraught disposition of a majority of the world's citizens, they appealed with the promise of strength and safety. The Republic, however, hoped to reach a sensitive world with their pleas, and although they gained the sympathy of a great many, their pleas generally fell on deaf ears as a result of a woeful misunderstanding of their audience. The impact of the images created by and for the Republic is a long-term one. They effectively evoke sympathy and guilt, but they were never successful in encouraging the greatly needed action by powerful foreign powers during the war. The images of the Spanish Civil War continue to haunt people around the world, reminding them of the atrocities of the war and all that occurred as the consequence of overwhelming global inaction. Francisco Franco successfully obtained control of Spain as the result of this brutal war, and he maintained his position as the head of state until his death in 1975. In the decades since the war ended, the impact of the war's images and the surprising outcome of the war have lingered, and the endurance of their legacy raises intriguing questions about the visual rhetoric of war imagery. The Spanish Civil War was dominated by Franco and his nationalists, and the visual imagery put forth by the two sides could very well explain how they so unequivocally defeated the Republic. So, my conclusion is that the visual campaign of the nationalists was a huge factor in the outcome of the war. However, in the grand scheme of human history, this is what wins, right? So we have the immediate effect of that logical front, but we have the lasting effect of the emotional images. So we can go to the Reina de Sofia in Madrid and we can see this huge mural that Picasso painted, and I'm getting goosebumps. You can see it, you can be overcome, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, this happened, this is terrible. And the idea here is that you can learn lessons, these valuable lessons from this visual rhetoric or these visual artifacts that reaches the emotion that these historical texts aren't always able to reach. So Franco won the war, he stayed in power, but he also has a legacy of being kind of a jerk, right? Whereas Picasso looks like a very sympathetic, empathetic person who now created this international symbol of the atrocities of war. There's even a tapestry outside of the United Nations representing it. So legacy-wise, the Republic won. And Franco, going back to our title, you guys remember last year was the 40th anniversary for SNL, and they did one huge special episode, and Franco's still relevant. And pay me, Bill. It's from a Spanish newspaper or website. I thought that was fun.
They're the people that got us up off of the beach and into the world. Thank you, Leon. And there's one that came too late for us to have a picture or a song to play for him. This just came in from Spain. Generalissimo Francisco Franco is still dead.
Okay. And that's my presentation.
Do we have any questions?
I didn't stage any, project offered.
I think it's wonderful that it was returned to the Museo Reina Sofia. And it's so interesting that Franco designated Juan Carlos to be the succeeding monarch, or anyway, rather than opposite of disavowed, about him to carry that spot. But then, ironically, Guernica moved from Museum of Modern Art, New York, to Reina Sofia. So on 2 counts, the royal family really came through. It's puzzling. It's just really puzzling.
I found a historical text that talked about Franco and his relationship with Juan Carlos, and he had this hope that he was going to carry on his policies, and so he had already decided he was going to name him as the successor, and he was going to hopefully keep this monarch, right? And Juan Carlos just was the furthest thing from what Franco hoped for. So after Franco died, Juan Carlos reintroduced democracy and kind of undid, actually not kind of, completely undid almost everything that Franco had done.
And there was an attempted revolt of the Cortes, the Congress of Spain, almost immediately afterwards. It's all on camera and everything, but Juan Manuel held strong, or Juan Carlos, excuse me, held strong and overthrew the overthrow, the attempt, and everybody breathed a sigh of relief. Yeah.
Yes.
Was he really this smart, or did he have really good advisors helping him out along the way?
Both. But, it was and that's why I called it the nationalist visual campaign. I think the fact that he maintained the support of the Catholic Church and the military helped, because he had kind of an infinite amount of resources. But where he was smart was that, and I kind of alluded to it, was that he kept his supporters at arm's length, meaning, sure, I'll partner with you, and got what he needed from them, and then stayed neutral during World War II. So it was like, sure, Hitler, come help me, but I'm not going to help you. And it was, in that sense, he was pretty smart. Yeah.
And do you think that that Hitler was able to look at him and learn from his success with propaganda and things like that? Or do you think it was the other way around, or they just didn't influence each other?
They didn't like each other, actually. They used what they needed from each other, and then it's pretty well documented in these texts that they just didn't like each other. They didn't like the way they behaved, in public. They didn't like anything.
Yeah.
It's odd, but yeah. I do think that Franco was smart in that he knew that his country needed unity, and so once he had the power, he backed down, he backed off a little bit, and he stayed out of the public eye for the most part. He intentionally kept Spain out of the international public for the most part. But then he got him into the United Nations. So, Spain was entered into the United Nations while he was a fascist dictator. So it's kind of, there's a lot of contradictions.
It's strange.
I think you're really onto something. I don't know if you realize this, but in January, last year, the University of Texas Press published Visualizing Guadalupe, and the first chapter is what jumps of Visualizing Guadalupe. It is so consistent with the propaganda efforts, and your work is visualizing, Franco. So there's some, this whole visualization, I think, is a movement now in various fronts, because Visualizing Guadalupe is a work of art history, and you're doing, what, is this
Lots of
English?
With this, it's visual rhetoric, so the chapters are what I've shown you, this is 3 of them, and then there's one about Guernica, the painting. But it's not art history necessarily as much as the intended and the perceived messages of these different images, and then using Kenneth Burke as my kind of lens to do that. So it's kind of a combination of both art history and traditional English, I guess.
Simone, can you tell me the distinction or the blend of propaganda versus rhetoric? Because
Propaganda is a type of rhetoric.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, it also depends on which rhetorician you're looking at.
Okay.
So, the reason, and Ron can help me with this, but the reason I prefer using Burke is because it's easier to apply. It gives you a nice little framework for understanding rhetoric. And Aristotle was pretty good at that too. Propaganda is kind of part of what gives, as we understand propaganda, it's kind of part of what gives rhetoric a bad name. It's that during campaign seasons, when people use the word rhetoric, it's almost dripping with disdain. And a lot of that falls back to how propaganda's become, or what it's become. But I mean, as it's, at its definition, it's just persuasion.
Right.
Well, I think that Aristotle emphasizes rhetoric as persuasion, whereas Burke emphasizes it as representation. So it's much more philosophically rich in Burke, and I presume that's why you're using Burke.
Yeah, I use Aristotle to support my Burkean analysis because Aristotle does put some emphasis on ethics, which is, and I intentionally stayed away from propaganda posters because there's tons of research out there already, and there's a lot of stuff already written about propaganda posters, and that's a little different. Is during the war there were separate visual campaigns that were largely done through these very literal propaganda posters, kind of like what we did during World War II here. And I just stayed away from that. The other thing is, we can probably interpret a lot of the visual rhetoric of anything as propaganda. It just depends on how it's presented and who it's presented to and who it's presented by.
How would you explain Mussolini and Hitler and Franco all at the same time in the early 20th century? What other cultural forces would have been in the background that made this visual rhetoric so powerful?
In a very simplified explanation, I think it's that period of pain and recovery that most of these countries found themselves in. Germany was pretty vulnerable after World War I, and they needed a really drastic answer. There were a lot of people just desperate, poor, and Hitler gave them a solution. So I think as far as that goes, there's an actual just need for it, and when they're feeling so desperate, presenting an image of strength is where the visual rhetoric, the success of the visual rhetoric comes in. The United States did not support Franco during the Spanish Civil War. They signed the non-intervention agreement and then followed through with it. So Ernest Hemingway, George Orwell, all of them, they went over, they came back, they talked to Roosevelt and his wife, and they said, look what's happening, please help us. And they didn't. They were emotionally distraught. One of my chapters is talking about a documentary film that they brought back and did a private showing for them, where Ernest Hemingway was the narrator, and it's kind of further emphasizing my argument, which was, yeah, they were emotionally distraught. They felt bad. But they had this country that they had to take care of, and America was still kind of distraught after World War I, and they couldn't just go rescue somebody during their Civil War when they had a country that was war-torn already. So Franco was successful at appealing to America, generally speaking, of, okay, they're fine, it's not that big of a deal.
I don't know anything about Burke, so can you just lay his background out for me? Is he like the man in rhetoric, or,
Yes.
or is he? And so where is he from? Did he teach, or was it? Or his ideas original?
He did. He taught all over the place here in the U.S. and he wrote in this period between World War I and World War II, and then all the way up to when he died, which was in the 70s, 80s. But Burke, the two books that I focus on, he wrote many more than that, but the two that I'm focusing on are these two. And this is where he really starts looking at the motives of, obviously, the motives of the speaker and trying to figure out an understanding. He would actually assert that he's not trying to give us a methodology for how to communicate, but give us a methodology for understanding how people communicate and why they communicate that way, for what end, things like that. And so that's what the focus is. Now, what I did kind of what a Burkean scholar that is one of my mentors, David Blakesley, does in his book, which is just really simplified it. And I take the dramatistic pentad and I say, here's my framework, let me analyze these images to show you why it had the success that it did communication or rhetorically. And so he draws a lot from things like drama and politics and different fields like that. He wrote a book called Attitudes Towards History, where he tries to look at different events in history and understand the way the communication worked and the audience's response to it. He did a really cool article focusing exclusively on the rhetoric of Hitler. Yeah, he's a pretty cool guy. He's also known for something called the Burkean parlor, which is kind of this, it's pretty popular in grad school when you're a rhetorical scholar, where you sit around in a circle kind of like this and you have conversations about understanding the way that you communicate and why.
It's the way we model the right place.
Yes.
As a Burkean part.
Where it's not, there's not a leader, but we're sharing in the ownership of the communication. It's interesting. Much of my understanding of agency comes from him.
Okay. He's got a nice mustache.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it seems like, well,
Not
not,
as yours.
yeah, not as that. It seems like some of the difference between fascism or propaganda is the use of your own face. I've never really explored that much. I mean, the Nazis used mongrel pictures of other races and other peoples to demonify them and villainify them, but it seems like when you look at modern fascists as well as these posters, I'm not calling Burke a fascist, right, but it's just, it's Burkean, right?
if you
It's
look-
not,
Successful in what works.
If you go
Right.
to Google Images, just Google
Right.
Images, and you type in Generalissimo Francisco
Right.
Franco,
right,
you're going to see a wide variety of images.
Mm-hmm.
And if you investigate, I can almost guarantee that the ones where that he looks differently depending on what time in history it was and who his target audience was.
yeah.
So there's entire biographies where I can show you tons of pictures of him with world leaders, and he's hobnobbing and he's got this really warm smile.
Right.
But during the war and at the beginning of his leadership, he's up there like Hitler, like what you see in Triumph of the Will, and he's up at this podium and he's got all of these massive people and he's like, yeah, and he's all short of doing the Nazi salute. He's very strong and he's stern and he's good. Towards the end of his time as the leader of Spain, he became much more isolated, and from what I understand from the biographies, what Georgette's telling me, that was almost the extent of his public life, was those occasional walks out to the balcony and waving and going back in. So at some point he got tired.
Don't you think that increased the mystique?
Oh, sure.
Like Castro in Cuba right now.
Oh, sure. And I think it also helped the more he stayed out of the public eye and the gentler he had an image, it definitely helped in their case in becoming part of the United Nations.
Simone, did you do a study on visual rhetoric in general or just specifically about Franco? Is that what you did? I mean, what your dissertation is about?
My dissertation's on the visual rhetoric of the two sides of the war. So I look at I divided them into 6 categories, like the images, and 3 of them are on the Republic and 3 of them on the national side. And I apply the pentad to understand the image, and then I draw my conclusion based off that. Now that means I created a whole lot of background information and historical context to try to place it and understand audience a little bit better. But as far as my field, if I had to identify, I've done a lot of research into visual rhetoric. I would say that's probably what, film, art, literature, it's all kind of.
That brings me my second part of the question. Hitler, Mussolini, Castro from Cuba was mentioned. Anybody else in recent history that we can say that's using these techniques?
All politicians.
All of them? Okay.
Yeah, good ones.
All right.
I think Trump currently
I see.
is definitely playing up to his audience right now, which is terrifying. So, you know, Molly and I had a long conversation about this a few weeks ago, that the thing that's scariest about it is if somebody keeps doing something in public office, you have to assume that they have a specific target audience in mind, and if they keep doing it, they're finding some success. And so it reveals a lot about the audience too.
Mhm.
So, but visually, yes, he's, you know,
Even just his
But-
brand, you know, I'm legitimate, it's everywhere. And
Right.
it's sort of like, I'm successful, and people buy it.
I mean, Marco Rubio tried, he was unsuccessful. Ted Cruz he tried leading up to the campaign season with like the little YouTube videos of him cooking bacon on his gun and things like that. I mean, in a less, that happened,
Oh, yeah.
yeah. In a less organized, official fashion, yes, I think Trump is probably the most successful, but I just blanked. Gaddafi is actually, he's him too. He was very successful in staying under the radar for a large part of his reign, and I think that that's effective visual rhetoric.
I mean, Trump's an evident one, but so is Bernie. And it's almost like a cult of personality. With Hillary, it's just Hillary and it's an icon, right? But with Bernie, it's his hair and it's him usually with his crooked finger yelling with a little bit
I
of
wouldn't
spit stuck
argue
on the
that
corner of his mouth.
there's even a single thing visually that they're doing that's not intentional. You know,
Right.
I think the traditional politicians are not going to do so well rhetorically because they're going with traditional rhetoric, and the audience wants something that's not traditional. So it's terrible.
Anybody else?
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.